about 5 months ago, I guess it is. And she lived with us for the last couple of years, and we were really glad that she was able to do that. And it was a special time for us, although it was sometimes a difficult time. But you know, I will never forget the last trip that we took with my mother. It's about a year ago. We were doing a family reunion cruise. And so my brother and my sister from Colorado and Atlanta and their spouses, and you know, there was about 8 of us total. We were meeting down in Florida to go on this cruise. It's going to be great. We were so looking forward to it. And the day came, our suitcases are packed, and then things started to kind of go haywire. You know, first of all, my mother decided, even though we've been planning this for months, that she really didn't want to go on this cruise. And so we had to convince her, you know, Mom, you really do want to go on this, and we used a little guilt. Your kids will be so disappointed if you're not there, and so we convinced her. And then we got to the airport. We took our first flight, which was to Atlanta. And then in Atlanta, we lost a carry-on bag, which happened to contain all of my mother's medicine. And so there is no way that we could get on the ship without this bag. And so I and my mother get on the next flight to Fort Lauderdale while Kathy goes to look for this bag, and she misses the flight. And then on the flight to Fort Lauderdale, my mother, without me hearing it or knowing about it, tells the flight attendant that she's feeling this intense pain. Well, it's from her arthritis. She lived with almost constant pain from that. But she told the flight attendant that she needed to go to the hospital. And I didn't know about this, didn't hear it. And so the next thing I know is they're announcing as we land in Fort Lauderdale and taxiing in that paramedics will be coming on board to remove a passenger before anybody else can get off the plane. And I heard that and I said, oh no. What did she do? I knew it had to be her. And so the paramedics come on and take my mother off, and then I spent about the next 15 minutes after I got off convincing them that she really didn't need to go to the hospital. She had her pain medicine, she just needed to take that, and you know, she'd be okay. And finally they took her vital signs and they said, well, yeah, she really does look fine. And so they did make her go to the hospital, and so then we spent about 4 hours in the airport waiting for Kathy to come in on the next flight. And so she finally arrives without the lost bag because they haven't found it. And so we go to the hotel because the cruise didn't leave until the next day. And so Kathy spends about 4 hours on the phone that evening talking to people in Atlanta, trying to track down this lost bag. Cannot do it, cannot find it. The next morning, she got on the phone again, and fortunately, due to her perseverance, we did find the lost bag. And so they said, okay, we'll get it right on the next flight to Fort Lauderdale. Of course, the next flight doesn't arrive until half an hour before our cruise leaves. And so I went back to the airport to wait for the lost bag. Kathy and my mother get on the ship, but as they're checking in, getting on, my mother says, I believe I have a word from God that this ship is going to sink and everybody on it is going to die. And so she says, I am not getting on the ship. Well, at that, my wife Kathy has had enough. She says, we have come this far. We've gone through all this difficulty so far. I spent 4 hours on the phone last night trying on your, you know, and she's had enough. And she said, you are getting on the ship. At which my mother gives her a look and says something like, well, I'm going to die soon anyway. And so they get on the ship, and meanwhile, I'm still at the airport, and of course, the flight that the bag is supposed to come in on is delayed. You know, it's like one thing after another here, and when it finally arrived, I grabbed the bag, I run for a taxi, I tell them, rush, you know, and I made it to the ship 5 minutes before the cruise leaves. So we didn't get to go on the cruise. But it did not turn out the way we planned. It wasn't the relaxing, enjoyable start to this great vacation that we planned on, right? Have you ever planned for something and you were looking forward to it and it was going to be so great and then it didn't turn out the way you planned? That's kind of how life works, isn't it? Life usually doesn't go the way we plan, does it? You know, maybe your plan for life was, I thought I was supposed to be married by now. Or I thought I was supposed to get a promotion by now, or I was supposed to retire by now, but I don't have the money. I was supposed to be out of debt. I was supposed to have children, or my children were supposed to turn out better. Or maybe the plan was simply, I wasn't supposed to go bankrupt. I wasn't supposed to lose my job. I wasn't supposed to get cancer. I wasn't supposed to lose somebody I love. I wasn't supposed to get divorced. That wasn't the plan. What do you do when life doesn't turn out the way you planned? The Bible has a lot to say about life plans. Probably the verse more people know than any other is the verse from the book of Jeremiah. If you've been around church very long, you've definitely heard this verse, probably many times. Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. And those are great words. That is a great promise. I love that promise. But you know what? There's a lot more meaning behind those words than most people understand. You see, the problem with just grabbing a verse out of the middle of the Bible and then going around quoting it is that you miss the context of that verse. And when Jeremiah wrote this verse, it was in the middle of a story in history, and the story shapes the whole meaning of that verse. And so this morning I want to tell some of that story, because we all have plans, don't we? We all have dreams of what we would like to see happen in our lives. But God does not say, Jeremiah, I know the plans you have for you, and I promise to bless your plans. He doesn't say that. He says, I know the plans I have for you. And if you study the Bible, you find that all the time God is actually interrupting people's plans for themselves and doing things in their lives that they hadn't planned at all. Noah did not plan on having to build an ark to save his family. Abraham didn't plan on having to leave his home and all of his relatives late in life to go someplace he'd never been. Esther did not plan on having to stop a mass murder of all her people. Moses did not plan on having to lead a rebellion against the Pharaoh. Mary did not plan on getting pregnant before she was married. In fact, there's not a single story in the whole Bible where it begins, well, some human being had a great plan. Because in the Bible, like in life itself, it's not about my plans or your plans, is it? And so with that said, let me tell you the story behind Jeremiah and what he wrote. In the ancient world, he had all these various nations with their own gods, kind of tribal gods. And the better the nation was doing, the higher the status of that nation's god. The general belief was that if your nation happened to be powerful and successful, it must be because your god was the strongest and most powerful god. But if your nation wasn't doing too good, well, your god must be a little bit weak. And so sometimes the weaker nations would adopt the gods of the stronger nations. Now, even though the nation of Israel worshiped the one true God, they were still very influenced by all these people around them, and they picked up on these ideas. And they did have a time when their God, their nation was the strongest one around. When David became king, he was a great warrior. He conquered all the territories around him. He was followed by his son Solomon. Those were the glory days. They were rich and powerful, but it obviously didn't last. And you know how when everything in your life is going good, everything seems to be fine, and you stop feeling like you need God so much, don't you? And then what happens? Well, you're not desperate for help. You know, it's kind of going fine by itself, and so your worship tends to slack off a little bit, and you get a little bit farther away from God because you're not so desperate for Him. Have you ever noticed that? And that's what happened to Israel. And the consequences of this are not good. After Solomon, things went straight downhill. The kingdom of Israel splits into two, and it would never be reunited. So now there's a northern kingdom which kept the name Israel, and there's a southern kingdom which calls itself Judah. I put that map up here. You can see Israel's in the blue, Judah's in the yellow. And Israel and Judah fought several wars between each other, which helped them, among other things, to become weaker and weaker compared to the nations around them. And then about 712 BC, a new world power named Assyria comes along and completely destroys the northern kingdom of Israel. Okay, so you can see the map on the side here, that blue kingdom, okay, that's basically gone. All the people who weren't killed are deported to other countries by Assyria, and Israel ceases to exist. It will never again return. You may have heard of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. Well, that's how they were lost. And so now the southern kingdom, called Judah, is all that's left of the original nation of Israel. And because Judah was still following God fairly closely, God kept the Assyrians from conquering Jerusalem, which in itself is pretty amazing because they conquered every other place. You can see this map here, and it's all this orange Assyria color. You can see everything is orange, basically, except it's not quite accurate because there's a little spot right in Jerusalem that the Assyrians never conquered because God was with them. Okay? Now, Judah manages to resist being conquered by the Assyria, but about 130 years later, and now we can go to the next map, a new superpower comes along. This time it's Babylon. And they conquer about the same area that Assyria did, but this time Judah has kind of wandered away from God, wandered a little too far, and so God does not protect them this time. And so Babylon obliterates Judah. All the cities, including Jerusalem, are destroyed, the temples demolished, and all the leaders of Judah, all the best and the brightest of the people, are taken away as captives. Thousands and thousands of people deported from all over Judah to Babylon, which was in modern-day Iraq. And none of them from that generation would ever see Israel again, because it wasn't until about 70 years later that some of the next generation were allowed to return to Israel. So they're living in Babylon now. They're in a foreign country, and Babylon had radically different gods, radically different values, different way of life. And you know what? Nobody in Israel ever planned for that kind of life. They're all wondering, what happened? We trusted in God. Where is God? I thought our God was powerful. Why didn't he save us? The exile to Babylon was by far the greatest crisis in the history of Israel. It wasn't just a matter of losing their homes or the temple or losing their dreams. It was a matter of, does God really even exist? Is he really the one God, or are these gods of Babylon actually more powerful? Was the whole thing a myth? Was our faith in God all a mistake? And if you read the Psalms, some of the Psalms were written while they were in Babylon. Psalm 137 starts out, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Jerusalem. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.' How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land?" You see, that's the real issue right there. How can we believe in God when he let us down? How can we sing about how he's so strong and he's so good when he didn't even save us? He let our nation be conquered. He let all our plans be shattered. And as these Jews settle into Babylon, they've got lots of questions. Questions like, how long is this exile going to go on? And how long are we going to be here? And what should we do while we're here? Should we cooperate with Babylon? Or should we start a resistance movement? Should we try to escape or rebel? And a bunch of the false prophets from Israel are saying, well, don't worry, our exile here is going to be really short. It won't be long till we're headed back to Israel. And so don't settle in, don't cooperate. Instead, let's isolate ourselves until we get to go home. Well, then, one day, a letter comes to these people from Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah is a prophet of Judah, but he was not taken captive to Babylon. He was one of the few who were allowed to stay in Jerusalem. And Jeremiah writes these words, which at the time were really controversial. They upset a lot of people. So let me read it to you. Jeremiah, starting 29, verse 4. "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my gracious promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Now, maybe you ask, well, what is so controversial about that? Why would people get ticked when Jeremiah writes this? Well, basically, there are two strategies when it comes to how do you live in exile. And by the way, we're going to see in a minute that this is not just a history lesson. This applies directly to you and me today. Okay, so just be patient, we'll get there. But the first strategy for living in exile is the one that Babylon wants. Babylon wants Israel to assimilate into the exile. They want to assimilate to their culture. You see, Babylon was gobbling up all these countries all over the map, and countries tend to resent that kind of thing, and they like to rebel. And so Babylon's strategy was, hey, we'll bring them to Babylon, we'll let them see our wealth and splendor and glory, and then they will adopt our ways. They'll take on our values, they'll live our lifestyles and worship our gods. If we can just get the people to assimilate to our culture, they won't be a problem anymore. They won't rebel, because they'll be just like us. And of course, if Israel were to do this, they would lose their identity, they'd lose their purpose, and they lose their relationship with God. You see, assimilation is the easiest thing, but it leads to nothing. No future, no hope, no relationship with God for eternity, a wasted life. And that is still true for you and I today. Assimilation into our culture is the easiest thing by far, but it leads to no future, no hope, a wasted life. It's easy to go with the flow, right? It's easy to act like everybody around you and talk like everybody around you and watch the same TV shows, try to own the latest cool stuff and get the clothes and the accessories and the cars and try to be popular. And while you're doing that, kind of downplay your faith. Don't let people at work or at school, really know about it. And it's all part of assimilation. And that is the easiest way to go, but it leads to no future, no hope. A wasted life. Well, a second possible strategy was not to assimilate, but to isolate. They could try to isolate themselves from the culture around them, shut it out, refuse to be a part of it. And this was the most popular idea among the Jews. This is what the false prophets recommended. Have nothing to do with Babylon. Shut yourself off. Hey, the exile is going to be short. We'll quickly be on our way home. So isolate yourself from the culture. Have nothing to do with it. But then comes Jeremiah's message from God, which is a third strategy. God says, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. By the way, isn't it kind of odd the way he says that? Who do the Jews think exiled them to Babylon? The Babylonian army, right? But what does God say? No. It was me. I'm the one who did that. I'm responsible. This is discipline from me. There's a reason I wanted you to go into exile. It's because I want you to learn some things. Then he goes on in verse 5. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. In other words, you're going to be in exile for a long time. As a matter of fact, this generation of people who are adults now, you will never return because it's going to be 70 years. But the point God is making here is you can handle it. Because what you really need is me. And I'm not just in Jerusalem. I'm the God of Babylon too. I'm the God of the whole world. And so I'll be with you in Babylon. I'll be with you in exile. And because of that, here's what I want you to do. Not assimilate, not isolate, but permeate. I want you to permeate the world around you. Here's the definition from dictionary.com. Permeate means to pass into or through every part of, as in bright sunshine permeated the room. So God is saying, I want you to be like a light in a dark place. I want you to permeate and change that dark place and make a difference for good, even in exile, even in Babylon. And God uses 3 examples. He said, build houses, plant gardens, and marry. There's a reason why he chooses those 3 instructions. Because in the Old Testament, there is a worship component of each one of them. In the book of Deuteronomy, it says that when you build a house, you are to bless it as an act of worship to God. When you plant a garden, you're to offer the first fruits to God as an act of worship to God. When there is a marriage, the couple enters into a covenant in the eyes of God, and that's an act of worship to God. And so in other words, God is saying, you can worship me even in Babylon, just as easily as in Jerusalem. And he goes on in verse 7, also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. So Jeremiah says, I want you to pray for the prosperity of Babylon. Now, think about this. Who was it that invaded their country, destroyed it, and took them into exile? It was Babylon. And Jeremiah says, yeah, I want you to pray for them, for their prosperity. I want you to pray to God for those people who ruined your lives. And not only that, I want you to bring peace to those people who brought war to you. And I want you to bring prosperity to the city that brought devastation to your city. No wonder the Jews did not like Jeremiah's letter. That'd be like somebody standing up here in front of you today and saying, well, God has showed me that we need to pray for the peace and prosperity of ISIS. Or maybe North Korea. You know, it'd be the same kind of, that would not be a popular message, would it? And so the question is, why would God say that to them? And what does this story mean for us today? Well, let's jump to the New Testament for just a minute. The book of 1 Peter. Peter's talking to Christians here, and he's telling them who they really are now that they've chosen to follow Christ. He says in chapter 2, verse 9, but you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a dedicated nation, God's own purchased special people. Beloved, I implore you as aliens and strangers and exiles in this world to abstain from the sensual urges, the evil desires, the passions of the flesh, your lower nature, that wage war against the soul. Now, did Peter just call you and me exiles? Yes, that's exactly what he said. He says you're a chosen race. Basically, he's saying when you become a follower of Christ, there's a bunch of things that change. First, you're a chosen race, so your race changes. A royal priesthood, so your purpose changes. And a dedicated nation, so your nationality changes. As a follower of Christ, your first allegiance is no longer to the U.S. You're part of God's dedicated nation. Which means that you and I are now exiles in this world, just like those Jews who were taken off to Babylon. Have you ever felt like an exile? Those of you who were in the military, I'm sure at one point, right at the start at least, you felt like an exile. I remember when I showed up at the Naval Academy as a 17-year-old, induction day was on July 7th, and my 18th birthday was on July 8th. That was not a great birthday, because all of us plebes at the Naval Academy were thrown into the most stressful time of our entire lives. All of us had been successful in high school. We got good grades. We were good at sports. We had some respect in high school, right? We had girlfriends and cars, or I know at least I did. And then all of a sudden we're thrown into this place where everything is taken away from you. They even cut all your hair off. They took your clothes and gave you a uniform. And now there's constantly people yelling at you, and we're in a strange place. We don't know anybody else here. Felt kind of like we were in exile. That's the feeling I'm sure it was like. And Peter says, you and I are now like exiles. Just like those Jews that got taken to Babylon. As followers of Christ, we're in the same situation they were, and we face the same choices that they did. And in fact, I believe that's why God put this story in the Bible. That's why he allowed that situation to happen to Israel, because he knew that one day we were going to need some guidance on how to live while in exile. And what's even more amazing is, if you look around today, the tendency of Christians in our world is to make exactly the same mistakes and to go in the same wrong directions as those exiles in Babylon. Our first mistake is the desire to assimilate. That's to assimilate to the culture around us. That's the easiest and most common strategy to fall into. And just like the Babylonians who wanted the Jews to assimilate and become just like all the other Babylonians and lose their values, lose their priorities, and adopt the same lifestyle and idols and gods as all the Babylonians, our world has three primary gods: money, sex, and power. Those are the gods of our society. And the world says, come worship our gods. Come worship money, sex, and power. Adopt our lifestyle. Live like we live. And value the things we value. Serve the gods of money, sex, and power. Assimilate and be like us. But God says to his people, I don't want you to assimilate. I don't want you to live like they live. I don't want you to walk closely with the world. I want you to walk really closely with me. Don't just follow blindly what the world does. Don't assimilate. Now, the second temptation we have is not to assimilate, but to isolate. This is the strategy that the false prophets of Israel were promoting, and this is a strategy you often see in many of the fundamental churches in our society. They say the world is evil, and so let's just shut ourselves off from the world. We'll create lots of little rules so that we'll look different and talk different and act different and dress different and act weird, and we'll become so inward focused that nobody would ever really want to come and join us. We'll isolate ourselves to keep the world out. But God says, I don't want you to isolate either. Yeah, I know you're exiles, but I don't want you to assimilate and become like the world, and I don't want you to isolate and shut yourself off from the world. Instead, I want you to permeate. In other words, to go into every part of our world and bring God's kingdom into every part and change the world. You see, Babylon's plan was to assimilate the Jews into their kingdom. God's plan is to assimilate Babylon and the rest of the world into his kingdom. And so God says, I want you to become a light in the darkness and permeate every part of the culture. And those words of Jeremiah apply directly to you and me today. In fact, let's go back and read them one more time and just apply them to us. He says, build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons, give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. In other words, you're going to be here in exile a long time, probably for the rest of your lives. And so do what you can to increase, not decrease. Then he goes on, also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. So God says to us today, I want you to pray for your city, pray for your country, your world, that it will be in peace and prosperity. God is saying the best way to bring light into the dark culture is to be a blessing to that culture. And so God is saying, I want you to be a blessing to your city. Be a blessing to the people around you. Work to increase it and improve education and the arts and be a blessing in work and in business. And make sure that you care for the poor and bring justice to the oppressed and work for peace and love your neighbors. Do all these things. In other words, everything you can, you do to be a blessing to your city in every possible way. To the point that those Babylonians or those non-Christians in Butler County, that they'll look at you and they'll say, you know what, it's a funny thing about those people. I may not believe their God, I may not agree with their values, but I sure am glad that they live here among us. Our community would be a poorer, darker place if those Christians weren't here. And God says, that's what the world should think of us exiles. And then in this context of being a light in the darkness and being a blessing to those who don't know God, that's when God goes on to say, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Now, here's the problem that we have when we hear that promise, is that many people immediately think, oh, this verse is all about how I can prosper and get blessed, there's more for me, and it becomes about what I can get. Which, by the way, is exactly what our world does, is we're always looking at what we can get. Our society is interested in what we can get out of our society. We have huge battles in government over taxes and spending, and nobody wants to give in or give up, because we're all worried about one thing: what can I get? And God says, no. I want you to be all about what you can give. I want people who are different. I want people who will go to Babylon, who will go to their city, their country, and think about, what can I give? So they decide that we're not going to serve the gods of money, sex, and power. We're not going to assimilate or isolate. Instead, because we're living for God, we're going to make our lives about what can we give instead of what can we get. God says, I want a royal priesthood, a nation of dedicated exiles who are changing their community by loving and serving people, by bringing peace, not more conflict, by being a blessing to others, and especially blessing to those who don't yet know God. God says, if I have a people who live like that, it'll be a light in the darkness. It'll spread my kingdom to every corner of this world. By the way, did you know that our job as Christians is not to get our culture to stop sinning? A lot of churches make that mistake. That is Jesus' job. That is not our job. Our job is to lead people to Jesus, who will then give them the power to stop sinning. But a lot of churches get confused about that, and they start condemning anybody who sins. Well, what do you expect Babylonians to do? What do you expect people who serve the gods of money, sex, and power to do? Of course they sin. And you are not going to stop them from sinning by condemning their sin. They're not going to change just because Christians condemn them, but they might change if somebody loves them enough to lead them to Jesus. They might change if somebody serves them or blesses them or prays for them. Jesus said, I didn't come to condemn the world, I came to save it. And so the church of Jesus should not be out there condemning the world either. We should be showing the love of Jesus. And that's why we do things like next week, our football Sunday. We want to use any possible opportunity we can have to permeate this world with the love of Jesus Christ. So if we can create a connection to some people through something like football, we're absolutely going to do it so that they can see the love of Jesus Christ. We are exiles with a mission. We are exiles with a mission to bring God's kingdom into dark places. And when we do that, watch out. That means that anytime that you are kind or helpful to a stressed out single mom, God's kingdom comes into a dark place. Anytime you're at the office and you go directly to a coworker to work out a problem instead of gossiping behind their back, God's kingdom comes into a dark place. When you ask God to help you at work to serve people and have a better attitude, then God's kingdom comes into a dark place. When somebody is nice and not nasty at a restaurant server, God's kingdom comes into a dark place. When somebody sees a need and jumps in to help, God's kingdom comes into a dark place. When somebody prays for someone else who is sick, God's kingdom comes into a dark place. On the other hand, when life is hard, when things are going against you and you take a big hit or you suffer, you're disappointed, do not be surprised and get a bad attitude. Because what do you expect? Welcome to Babylon. We're exiles, and exiles by definition have a tough time. At least some of the time. If you're not having a hard time at all, it probably means you've assimilated. You're living in the wrong kingdom. You see, the God we follow, Jesus, knew all about being in exile. He learned about that when he was a little boy, and his family lived in exile in Egypt. But it continued throughout his whole ministry. There were parts of Israel he had to stay away from because they were trying to kill him. He said one time, birds of the air have their nests and foxes have a hole in the ground, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. And Jesus' final steps were to carry his cross outside the gate of Jerusalem, because a crucifixion by law had to happen outside the gates of the city so it could communicate to everybody that this person was cast out, rejected, and dying as an exile. And then one last step into exile. On the cross, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The ultimate exile, when he's exiled from his own Father. You see, an exile learns something. He learns that this life is not about what can I get while I'm here. Because this isn't my real home. This is not my city. So it's not about what can I get here. It's about who can I bring there. Who can I bring into God's kingdom? We are all exiles with a mission. We give up our own plans. We look for ways to give, not get. And that's when God says to us, "For I know the plans I have for you," declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. God is speaking this great promise to us exiles. He says, "I know the plans I have, the plans for you exiles, to bring light into a dark world. I know the plans I have, they're to give you a hope and a future, but they're not your plans. And they're probably not easy plans. They're certainly not pain-free plans. But they are Jesus' plans. And his plans hold the hope of this world." I'd like the worship band to come up, do a closing song for us. As they come up, let's stand together in prayer. Heavenly Father, we want to thank you that you're here with us right now, that you allow us to come so close to you, to have such a close relationship with you. You know all about our hopes, our dreams, and our disappointments. You know them all. For some of us here, it might be something that happened financially, or it might be a relationship that's broken. Maybe a divorce. It might be being alone. It might be failure. It might be rejection. It might be shame. For some of us here, maybe things are working out just according to plan right now. But a day will come in a week or a month or a year. And so, Father, we ask together as brothers and sisters in Christ, as a family, we acknowledge to you right now that our plans are not the ultimate plans. We can only see a little bit of what you're doing. Sometimes we cling so hard to our own plans that when our dreams die, it feels like that we're going to die. But when you now, God, speak to us just as you did to those people in Babylon, those people in exile. We thank you for your words. I know the plans I have for you. Not your plans, not easy plans, but better plans. So God, would you help us to live with you and surrender to you as we live with exiles with